The morning Margaret Underwood stepped off the westbound train in Harlan Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1882, she was carrying three things: a battered leather satchel, a heart full of carefully measured hope, and a folded document she had spent 4 evenings composing by lamplight in her small Philadelphia boarding house room, a document that would either save her future or end it before it had properly begun. The platform was dusty and loud, smelling of coal smoke and cattle and sun-baked timber, and the whole town of Harlan Creek stretched out before her like a sentence she had not yet learned how to read. She was 26 years old, which was considered by most of polite Philadelphia society to be dangerously close to unweddable, and she had a sharp mind that had cost her 2 engagements, already one to a banker's son who wanted a decorative wife, and one to a schoolteacher who had wanted a quiet one. Margaret Underwood had never in her life managed to be either decorative or quiet, and she had stopped apologizing for it somewhere around her 23rd birthday. She smoothed her traveling dress, the blue wool one that had seen better days but still held its shape with a kind of stubborn dignity, and she looked down at the folded paper tucked into the outer pocket of her satchel. She had read it herself so many times that she could recite it from memory. It was a counter-proposal, written in her neat, precise hand, and it answered point by point the advertisement that had appeared in the Philadelphia Inquirer 3 months prior. The advertisement had read as follows: "Widower, 30 years, cattle rancher, Harlan Creek, Nevada Territory, seeks wife of good character and sound constitution. Must be willing to work. Children possible in time. Write to Isaac Donnelly, General Post, Harlan Creek." It was not the most romantic advertisement Margaret had ever read. It was not even the most detailed. But there was something honest about it that had caught her attention like a burr catching wool, and she had sat down that same evening to compose her reply. She had sent the reply, received a brief but polite letter in return, exchanged 3 more letters over the following weeks, and then, when Isaac Donnelly had sent what amounted to a formal proposal, a short paragraph describing the arrangement he envisioned, the duties expected, the household she would be entering, Margaret had done something no woman in the history of the Harlan Creek matrimonial correspondence service had apparently ever done. She had written a counter-proposal. It was 6 pages long. She had been very thorough. She stepped down from the platform onto the packed dirt street and looked around for a man who might be Isaac Donnelly. The advertisement had said 30 years, and she had been told in his last letter that he would meet her at the station wearing a brown hat and a blue bandana. There were 3 men on the platform with brown hats, and she was just beginning to despair of the whole enterprise when a voice to her left said, "Miss Underwood." She turned. He was taller than she had imagined, though she was not sure why she had imagined him any particular height at all. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the edges where it escaped his hat brim, and eyes the color of old creek water, a kind of gray-green that was neither one thing nor the other, but was somehow more interesting for it. His face was weathered but not harshly so, the kind of face that had spent years in sunlight without becoming hardened by it. He was wearing the brown hat and the blue bandana, and he was holding it in his hands now, turning it with the uncertain movements of a man who was not accustomed to being nervous, but was finding himself so anyway. "Yes," she said, "you must be Mr. Donnelly." "Isaac," he said, and then seemed to check himself, as if offering his first name had been too forward. "That is yes, Isaac Donnelly. Welcome to Harlan Creek." She offered her hand in the direct way she had that always startled men who were expecting a more delicate greeting, and he took it and shook it once firmly, which she noted with approval. "I have something I need you to read," she said, "before we go any further." He blinked. "Right now. I think it would be better if we were both clear about things from the beginning," she said. She reached into the outer pocket of her satchel and drew out the folded document, which was 6 pages of cream-colored paper covered in her careful handwriting, and she held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. He unfolded the first page, and she watched his expression carefully. His brows drew together slightly as he read, not with displeasure but with concentration, the look of a man taking something seriously. She had been half afraid he would laugh. He did not laugh. He read the first page, turned it, read the second, and his expression shifted through something she could not quite name, surprise perhaps, and something else, something quieter. He was still on the platform. The train had pulled out now and the last of the other passengers had dispersed, and it was just the two of them standing in the thinning coal smoke with the sound of Harlan Creek going about its afternoon business around them. A dog crossed the street at the far end. A wagon rattled past. Someone inside the nearest building was hammering something. He read all 6 pages. She counted. It took him nearly 12 minutes. When he looked up, his gray-green eyes were doing something complicated that she could not categorize. She said preemptively, "I know it is not what you were expecting." "No," he said. He looked down at the papers again briefly and then back at her. "No, it is not." He cleared his throat. "You have asked for your own room." "I have," she said, "at least to begin with, until we have had time to determine whether we are genuinely suited. You have asked for the right to refuse any social obligation you find morally objectionable." "I have," she said. "You have asked for 2 afternoons a week that are entirely your own to use as you see fit." "I have," she said, and she kept her chin level and her voice steady, because she had rehearsed this conversation almost as many times as she had written the document, and she was not going to falter now. "You have specified," he said, looking at the final page, "that should we find ourselves incompatible after a period of 6 months, you would like to have the option to dissolve the arrangement without social censure, and you have proposed that I would provide you with funds sufficient to establish yourself elsewhere." "It seemed only fair," she said. "You are taking on very little risk in this arrangement, Mr. Donnelly. You have a house and a livelihood and roots here. I have given up what little I had." He was quiet for a moment. Then he folded the 6 pages with the same care he had unfolded them, and he looked at her with that complicated expression, and he said, "Miss Underwood." "Yes." "She will do more than fine." She stared at him. "I beg your pardon." He had color along his cheekbones. She would learn later that he flushed when he was embarrassed and that it was one of the most honest things about him. "I mean," he said, "that you will do more than fine. That I was saying it to myself, I suppose. I apologize. That came out incorrectly." He cleared his throat again and put on his hat. "I mean to say that your terms are, I accept them." She had prepared for a number of responses. She had prepared for refusal, for negotiation, for condescension, even for laughter. She had not quite prepared for acceptance. She felt something unknot itself in her chest, something she had not known was knotted there. "All of them," she said. "All of them," he said. "Your own room, your afternoons, the dissolution clause." He paused. "Though I hope it will not come to that." "So do I," she said, and she meant it. She picked up her satchel. "Shall we go, then?" He took the satchel from her before she could protest, not in a presumptuous way, but in a quiet, practical way that somehow managed not to be condescending. And he led her to where a wagon was waiting at the edge of the platform, hitched to 2 solid-looking bays. The drive out to the Donnelly ranch took the better part of an hour, along a road that started out respectable and became progressively more a suggestion than an actual thoroughfare. The landscape was vast and golden red in the afternoon light, and the sky was the kind of enormous sky that simply did not exist in Pennsylvania, the kind that made a person feel simultaneously small and expanded. Margaret sat on the wagon bench beside him and tried to absorb it all. He was not a talkative man. She had gathered that from his letters, which had been thorough but economical. But she noticed that he pointed out things as they drove: a hawk riding a thermal above the ridge to the north, the spot where the creek curved close enough to the road that you could hear it in spring, the property line marked by a row of ancient posts that his grandfather had put in when the land was first claimed. He offered these observations the way a person offers a gift to someone they are not sure of, carefully, without ceremony, watchful for the response. She asked questions. He answered them. By the time the ranch came into view, a solid, square-framed house with a wide porch, 3 outbuildings, and a corral holding a dozen horses. She knew that he had been born in Harlan Creek, that his wife Clara had died 18 months ago of a fever that had swept through the valley, that they had had no children, that he had 2 ranch hands named Pete and Arlo who lived in the bunkhouse, and that he kept 40 head of cattle on 600 acres. She knew also, because she noticed these things, that he had cleaned the wagon thoroughly before coming to meet her, that his shirt was pressed despite being work-worn, and that when the horses shied at a jackrabbit bolting across the road, he steadied them with quiet hands and not a single curse word. She thought, this might work. The house was clean inside, cleaner than she had expected, though it carried the particular smell of a dwelling without a woman's touch, not dirty but sparse, functional, stripped of anything that was not necessary. The parlor had good bones. The kitchen was well organized. Her room, and he showed it to her first before anything else, which she noted was on the east side of the house, smaller than his but with a window that looked toward the mountains, and it had been recently whitewashed and supplied with fresh linens folded at the foot of the bed. "I was not sure what else you might need," he said from the doorway. "I can get whatever is wanted from town." "This is fine," she said. "This is more than fine." She turned and almost smiled at her own word choice, and he caught it, and something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile either, but in that direction. "Supper is at 6, he said. "I cook adequately. You are welcome to take over that duty if you prefer, or to share it, or to leave it entirely to me, whichever you like." "I cook well," she said. "I would like to share it." "Good," he said, and she heard something genuine in the word, something that went slightly beyond mere practicality. She unpacked her satchel in the quiet of her whitewashed room, while the afternoon sun came through the window and lay in gold bars across the floorboards, and she looked at the mountains through the glass, and she thought that this was stranger and harder and more interesting than anything she had done before, and that she was glad she had written the counter-proposal, and that she was glad he had read every word of it. The first week was a careful dance of proximity and distance, both of them learning the rhythms of the other the way you learn a river, where it runs shallow enough to cross, where it drops into depths you cannot see the bottom of. Margaret rose before 6 and had water boiling for coffee by the time Isaac came in from the early morning check of the stock. He took the coffee without comment, but with a consistency that told her he was grateful. She handled breakfast. He handled dinner. They split the supper cooking and found, to the mild surprise of both, that they worked in the kitchen with an easy efficiency, neither getting in the other's way. She established her 2 afternoons immediately. Tuesdays and Thursdays, after the midday meal, she took herself to the small table in her room with paper and pen. She had been corresponding with a friend in Philadelphia, a woman named Ruth Calloway, who ran a small school for girls out of her own home, and she had been helping Ruth develop a reading curriculum. It was not paid work, and she had not told Isaac about it, not because she was hiding it, but because she did not yet know how to offer him the interior rooms of her life. On the 5th day, he knocked on her door at 2:30 on a Tuesday, which was one of her afternoons, and she opened it with her pen still in her hand and ink on 2 fingers. He looked at the pen. He looked at the ink. He said, "I am sorry, I did not realize you were working." "What did you need?" she asked. "Nothing that cannot wait," he said, and he left, and he did not knock again on a Tuesday or Thursday afternoon for the remainder of the month, which told her something important about the kind of man he was. She saw him work. That told her things too. He worked with his whole self, the way people do when they love what they do and have never thought of it as separate from who they are. He was patient with his horses in a way that was almost musical, speaking to them in a low, continuous murmur while he worked, and she discovered this early one morning when she walked out earlier than usual and stood at the fence of the corral watching him with a gray gelding that was new to the herd and nervous. He had not seen her yet, and he was talking to the horse in that low voice, telling it things she could not hear, moving around it in slow circles, and the horse was beginning to drop its head. When he finally noticed her at the fence, he did not startle. He just glanced up and nodded, as if she had every right to be there, and went on with what he was doing. She thought, he is a good man. This was not a small thought. She had known plenty of men who were fine in the narrow sense, upstanding, reliable, law-abiding, without being actually good. The distinction had cost her 2 engagements to learn, and she held onto it carefully. In the second week, she made a discovery about Harlan Creek itself. She had walked into town on a Wednesday morning, while Isaac was out with his hands checking the south fence, and she found that Harlan Creek was the kind of small western town that had a great deal of life in it if you knew how to look. There was a general store run by a woman named Della Briggs, whose husband was frequently absent on freight runs, and who therefore ran the place entirely herself with calm competence. There was a saloon that Margaret had no intention of entering, but which she observed was a good deal more orderly than the saloons in the stories she had read. There was a tiny school with 23 students and a young teacher named Mr. Horace Vane, who looked barely older than his oldest students, and was managing the situation with visible desperation. She went into the general store and introduced herself to Della Briggs, who had a broad, weathered face and the direct eyes of someone who dealt with the world as it actually was and not as anyone wished it to be. "You're Isaac Donnelly's bride," Della said, not as a question. "I am," Margaret said. "Well, we are not yet married. We are still in the arrangement phase." Della looked at her with something approaching appreciation. "Good sense," she said. "Most women who come out here married to a man they've never met spend the first year recovering from the shock." "I intend to avoid shock where possible," Margaret said. Della sold her thread, a packet of writing paper, and a small bottle of good ink, and when Margaret was leaving she said, "Isaac Donnelly is a decent man. He was a good husband to Clara, and that is worth something out here." "I know," Margaret said. "I can tell." She walked back to the ranch in the dry, bright morning air, and found that she was thinking about him, specifically about the way he had accepted her counter-proposal without a single moment of condescension, and about how he talked to horses, and about the particular quality of his silence, which was not the silence of someone with nothing to say, but the silence of someone choosing carefully what to say. She was not in love with him. She was 26 years old and had been disappointed enough times to be careful about that word. But she was attending to him. She was paying him the particular attention she paid to things she found genuinely interesting, and she knew herself well enough to know that this was something. The crisis came in the third week, and it came in the form of a man named Gerald Cotter. Cotter had a ranch 2 miles to the east and had been, according to Pete the ranch hand, who had an opinion about most things and was not shy about sharing them, sniffing around the Donnelly land since before Clara was cold in the ground. He wanted the water access that the creek on the eastern boundary provided, and he had twice made offers to Isaac that Isaac had twice declined. Margaret met him when he rode up to the house on a Tuesday afternoon, and knocked on the front door. Isaac was out. She answered the door. Cotter was perhaps 45, thick through the middle, with the kind of surface affability that sits on top of something harder and less pleasant, like whitewash on a bad fence. He looked her over in the way she disliked most, assessing and dismissive in a single glance, the way men who have decided on their opinion before gathering any evidence tend to look. "You must be the mail order woman," he said. "I am Margaret Underwood," she said, "and I am not here by mail order but by my own considered decision. What can I do for you?" His eyes sharpened slightly. "I was hoping to speak to Isaac." "He is not here," she said. "If you would like to leave a message, I can deliver it." "Tell him I've raised my offer on the east parcel," Cotter said. "Tell him I'm willing to go to $800, which is more than that land is worth, and he knows it. And tell him," he paused, and the smile that followed was not a pleasant one, "tell him that the right woman might have better sense than a stubborn man." She understood him completely. He thought she could be used as leverage, that a woman who had come west to find a husband would be susceptible to suggestion, would perhaps whisper in Isaac's ear in the direction Cotter preferred. It was, she thought, a remarkably poor understanding of the kind of woman she was. "I will tell him you raised your offer," she said. "I will not tell him anything else, because what you have just implied is something I would rather keep between you and your conscience." She held his gaze for a steady 3 seconds. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cotter." She closed the door. When Isaac came in that evening, she told him about Cotter's visit, word for word including the part she had said she would rather keep between Cotter and his conscience. He listened to all of it with his creekwater eyes steady on her, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment and then he said, $800. "Yes," she said. "He went up from 650, he said, mostly to himself. "Are you considering it?" She asked because she thought he had the right to consider it without her opinion unless he asked. "No," he said. "The water access is the whole east side. Without it I lose a third of my grazing." He looked at her. "You closed the door on him." "He was rude," she said simply. The corner of his mouth moved in that way it had, not quite a smile but the idea of one. "I expect he was not accustomed to that." "He was not," she confirmed. He picked up his coffee cup and turned it in his hands. She had noticed this habit, that he touched things when he was thinking, and then he said, "Thank you for telling me all of it." "I always will," she said, and she meant that in a broader sense than just Cotter, and she thought from the way he looked at her that he heard it in that broader sense. The month turned, and the weather warmed and Harlan Creek moved into the kind of early summer that the desert does well, brilliant mornings and long evenings lit with gold, and the smell of sage coming on the warm winds. Margaret had begun, with Isaac's knowledge and easy permission, to spend part of her Tuesday afternoons writing letters to Mr. Vane at the schoolhouse, sharing the reading curriculum materials she had been developing with Ruth in Philadelphia. Vane had replied with such genuine gratitude that she had felt something light up in her that she recognized as purpose, and purpose was a thing she had been missing. One evening she mentioned it to Isaac over supper, the letters to Vane, the curriculum, Ruth's school in Philadelphia. She had not mentioned it before because she had not been sure how to. He listened to all of it, the way he listened to most things, with the particular quality of attention that felt like being taken seriously, and when she finished he said, "Can I see one?" "One of the letters to Vane?" She was startled. "Why?" "Because I'd like to know what you're working on," he said, and it was said plainly, without strategy, without any particular motive beyond what the words themselves said. She brought him the most recent letter after supper and sat across from him while he read it. He read it with the same careful thoroughness with which he had read her counter-proposal on the platform. She was beginning to understand that he read things the way he listened to people, with his whole attention. When he finished he said, "This is good work." "Thank you," she said. "Vane's school needs more than a curriculum," he said. "It needs supplies. I could bring that up at the town meeting next month if you wanted." She looked at him. "You would do that? Why wouldn't I?" he said, with what appeared to be genuine puzzlement. She thought about the banker's son, who had thought her intellectual interests were a charming eccentricity to be gently discouraged. She thought about the schoolteacher who had agreed with everything she said and then done whatever he intended to do anyway. She said, "Not every man finds it worth his while to support a woman's work." His brow drew together, not with offense, she thought, but with something more like sadness. "Then they were fools," he said simply. She felt something shift in her chest, something that had been guarded beginning to ease, like a door left ajar on a fine day. She had not meant to begin to love him so soon. She had given herself 6 months, the dissolution clause, a careful, measured approach. She had been so certain of the wisdom of caution. But the wisdom of caution, she was discovering, did not account for a man who talked to horses and read carefully, and looked at her work without condescension, who had accepted every term of her counter-proposal without a flicker of resentment, who made coffee each morning with the wordless understanding that she needed it before she could be civil to the world, and who had, she was quite sure, turned down $250 of additional profit on a land sale rather than use her as a tool. She was, she admitted to herself, in the beginning of something she had not entirely planned for. 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, Pete came to the house with a gash on his forearm from a wire fence, and Margaret cleaned and dressed it with the practical calm she had developed over years of looking after herself in a boarding house with no access to medical care. And Pete, who had been visibly skeptical of her since her arrival, looked at her afterward with an entirely different expression. "You done this before," he said. "I have," she said. "Clara used to do it too," he said, and then seemed to check himself as if he had said something he shouldn't. "It's all right," she said. "You can speak of her." He looked at her sideways. "Isaac don't." "I know," she said. This was true. Isaac did not speak of Clara. There were small traces of Clara in the house, a faded curtain in the parlor that Margaret had recognized as a different style from the rest, a Bible on the shelf with Clara's maiden name written inside, a pressed flower between 2 pages of a book on the kitchen shelf. But Isaac moved around these traces with the careful silence of a man who is carrying grief in a container he has decided must not be disturbed, because if it is disturbed it will spill. She thought about this. She thought about it carefully, the way she thought about everything, turning it over and looking at it from multiple angles. She was not jealous of Clara, that would have been both uncharitable and illogical, but she thought that the grief needed to be spoken sometime, and that until it was, there would be a room in Isaac Donnelly that she could not enter. She did not push it. She was patient, in the way she was patient with things that mattered. The town meeting was on the 3rd Friday of the month. Isaac took her with him, which was not nothing. In a town this size, to appear at a public meeting with a woman was to make a statement, and the statement was not lost on the people of Harlan Creek, who had the communal observational powers of people who live in small places and know each other entirely. She sat beside him in the rows of wooden chairs that had been arranged in the main room of the saloon, which also served as the town's meeting hall. She recognized Della Briggs 3 rows ahead and exchanged a nod with her. She saw Mr. Vane near the back, looking startled and pleased to see her. She saw Gerald Cotter on the opposite side of the room, who acknowledged Isaac with a nod that contained its own kind of calculation, and acknowledged her not at all. The meeting covered the usual matters, the state of the roads, a dispute over fence placement between 2 ranchers who sat at opposite ends of the room and did not look at each other, the question of what to do about a family whose well had gone dry. Then Isaac raised his hand and spoke about the school, about its supply shortage, about the curriculum materials being developed by Margaret in correspondence with a Philadelphia educator, and he said it all plainly, and without either condescension toward her or false modesty about the work she was doing. She felt the room look at her. She was accustomed to being looked at with various mixtures of skepticism and dismissal, but what she felt in the room was something more like assessment, the particular way small communities look at newcomers to determine whether they might be of use, and she returned the collective gaze with the directness she had always offered the world. The outcome was a collection taken up on the spot, $43, which was a great deal of money for a small town, and a pledge from Della Briggs to match it from the store's community account. Mr. Vane looked as if he might weep with relief. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Isaac said, "You handled the room well." "I have been in rooms before," she said. "Not like this one," he said. "Eastern rooms and Western rooms are different animals." She considered this. "Western rooms are more direct. Most things out here are," he said. He helped her up onto the wagon bench. She had stopped protesting this particular form of assistance because it was not condescension, she had decided. It was simply that the wagon step was genuinely treacherous, and he climbed up on his side and took the reins, and they rode back toward the ranch in the evening that was turning all shades of amber and rose, and the mountains in the distance went purple. "Isaac," she said, when they were a mile out of town. "Yes." "When did Clara die? Exactly, I mean, what month?" He was quiet for a moment. The horses kept their easy trot. "October," he said. "October of '80. He paused. 18 months before you arrived, give or take. "Were you very happy?" she asked. With her, another pause, longer, she did not fill it. "Yes," he said. We were well suited. She liked this life and she was good at it. He turned the reins slightly, guiding around a rut in the road. She was very different from you. She was quieter, more content with things as they were. He said it without comparison, without implication, simply as a fact. I am sorry you lost her, Margaret said. I am too, he said, and it was said with a simplicity that was more affecting than any elaboration would have been. I want you to know, she said, that I do not expect you to have finished with that, with grieving. I know that is not how it works. He looked at her then briefly because the road required his attention. You are an unusual woman, Miss Underwood. Margaret, she said. It was the first time she had offered him her first name rather than waiting for him to ask. He faced the road again. The horse's hooves made their steady sound on the dry earth. Margaret, he said, as if he was testing the word, learning the weight of it. She looked at the purple mountains and felt the warm wind on her face and thought that she was falling in love with Isaac Donnelly, which was not in the counter-proposal, and which she was finding she did not mind at all. Summer came to the high desert with its full force, brilliant and relentless, and life at the Donnelly Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt less like an arrangement and more like a life. Margaret learned to read the weather in the mountains. Isaac taught her, pointing out the cloud formations that meant rain and the quality of morning light that meant a hot day. She learned how to handle the two horses that were her particular responsibility, a pair of solid sorrels named Dublin and Cork, because Isaac had apparently a soft spot for Irish names applied to horses, something she found charming and told him so, and he had looked pleased in the quiet way he had of looking pleased. She had begun to help Della Briggs with the store's accounts on Monday mornings, because Della's bookkeeping system had gaps in it that Margaret had identified in a single glance and offered to address. Della had accepted without ceremony and paid her a small sum that Margaret tucked away into a personal account, not because she intended to use the dissolution clause, but because she believed women should have their own money regardless of the security of their circumstances. This was a principle she had held since she was old enough to understand how the world treated women who had none. She told Isaac about the account. She had decided very early that she would not keep things from him, partly because honesty was fundamental to who she was, and partly because she thought their arrangement could only become something better than an arrangement if it was built on things that were real. He said, "Good," which was characteristically brief, but the way he said it with a kind of warmth underneath the word told her he understood her reasoning completely. The summer also brought a trouble that started small and grew larger. Cotter's behavior became less the mere persistence of a man hoping to wear down a stubborn neighbor and more actively problematic. It started with a fence, a section of the boundary fence between the Donnelly land and Cotter's, which turned up moved 6 feet in the wrong direction. Isaac rode out to look at it, came back quiet and tight around the jaw, which she was learning was what he looked like when he was genuinely angry. He moved the fence line, she said. Post holes are fresh, Isaac confirmed. He sat down at the kitchen table. She set coffee in front of him without him asking. It's 6 feet, but it's 6 feet that puts the corner of his property line athwart my water access. Can you prove he moved it, she asked. Pete and Arlo both remember where those posts were, he said. We put them in ourselves 2 winters ago. Then that is your evidence, she said. She sat down across from him. You need the sheriff. Vickers is a good man, but he has a lot of territory to cover, Isaac said, and Cotter has a way of making things complicated. All men who do what they are doing always have a way of making things complicated, she said evenly. That is not a reason not to push back. He looked at her over his coffee cup with those gray-green eyes, and she saw something in them that was becoming familiar, a particular quality of warmth that he directed at her and only at her, that she was increasingly sure had not been in the transaction when she had stepped off the train in her blue wool dress. You push back, he observed. Constantly, she agreed. I recommend it. She went to see Sheriff Vickers herself the following day. On the ground that she had the Monday morning free after the bookkeeping and that Harlan Creek was a 40-minute ride she was now capable of making unaccompanied on Dublin. She presented the situation to Vickers clearly, factually, without heat: the moved fence posts, the fresh post holes, the witnesses, the pattern of Cotter's prior approaches. Vickers listened with the careful attention of a man who knew his territory and knew which stories fit the patterns he had seen before. "I know about Cotter," he said. "I'll ride out and have a look." "Thank you," she said. "You are Isaac Donnelly's." He hesitated. "Margaret Underwood," she said. "We are engaged." She had not actually used that word before, but she found that it was accurate enough and that it clarified her standing in the conversation. Vickers nodded. "He's a good man, Isaac." "He is," she said. She rode back to the ranch and arrived to find Isaac in the yard with Arlo, who had the look of a man who had just been told the news was complicated. Isaac looked up when she rode in, and his expression went through surprised, and then, when she dismounted, with the specific manner of someone who has accomplished a thing knowing. "You went to Vickers," he said. "I did," she said. "He will ride out." He was quiet a moment. Then he said, "Margaret." "Yes. You went to the sheriff without telling me." She kept her eyes on his. "I had the opportunity in the morning and I thought it needed doing. Was I wrong?" He held her gaze for 5 full seconds, and then he shook his head and the almost smile appeared. "No," he said. "You were not wrong." He paused. "Thank you." "You are welcome," she said, and led Dublin back to the corral. Arlo, she noticed, had been watching this exchange with an expression of frank bewilderment, as if he had seen something he was not sure his vocabulary was adequate to describe. Vickers came out within the week, surveyed the fence situation, interviewed Pete and Arlo, and sent a formal notice to Cotter that the posts were to be returned to their original positions within 10 days, or he would be looking at a trespass complaint. Cotter complied, with the bad grace of a man who has been outmaneuvered on the field he chose, and Isaac moved the fence posts himself just to be certain they were where they needed to be. And Margaret watched from the yard and thought about how the satisfaction of justice done was one of the most uncomplicated pleasures available to a person. The matter of Cotter was effectively settled, though she did not think Cotter himself was settled. She made a note of this and kept it. It was late August when things between her and Isaac moved from the careful arrangement they had been and became something else. It happened on a Thursday evening, in the ordinary way that significant things often happen, without announcement, without ceremony, without the events having the decency to look important before they become so. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit without either of them naming it as one. The sky was doing what the Nevada desert sky did on August evenings, spreading itself out in colors so excessive they seemed improbable, and she had been thinking about a letter she needed to write, and he had been looking at the ridge line in the way he had of looking at the landscape as if it was telling him something. He said, without preamble, "My father wanted to sell this land when I was 12. She turned to look at him. He was not looking at her, still looking at the ridge. "He had an offer from a mining company," Isaac continued. "This was before the cattle operation was anything. We were just starting. The money would have been, it was a lot, for a man who didn't have much." "My mother refused." "What happened?" she asked. "She said the land was worth more than money," he said. "She said she could see something in it that my father couldn't yet." She was right. He paused again. "She was right about most things she cared about. She paid attention in a way my father sometimes didn't." He was quiet. She waited because she had learned that his silences were not endings but pauses for breath before he continued. "Clara was the same way," he said. "She saw things, people mostly. She could read a person the way you read a book." He turned and looked at her then, directly. "You are the same way. The way you came off that train with your counter-proposal and sized up exactly what you needed." "I had a lot of practice sizing up situations," she said. "I expect you did," he said, and his voice had that particular warmth in it that was becoming the most familiar thing in the world to her. "Isaac," she said. "Yes. I think I should tell you that that my feelings have changed somewhat from when I arrived." She kept her voice steady. She had decided she would tell him when it was true and not keep it behind the counter-proposal and the dissolution clause, because that would be a kind of dishonesty. I came here as an arrangement, and it is becoming something else. For me. He looked at her for a long moment. The sky had gone from orange to deep rose. From somewhere on the hillside a coyote made its thin, lonesome sound. For me also, he said. She felt the warmth of that reach her. She said, I want to be sure you are not, that Clara is not still. She is always going to be part of what I am, he said. I cannot offer you a man without that. I would not insult you by pretending otherwise. He held her gaze. But I am not still lost in it, if that is what you are asking. It has been nearly 2 years. And he stopped. And she said, and you are difficult to not pay attention to, he said, with a directness that surprised them both and made something laugh in his eyes, which was a thing she had not yet seen there, and which was, she thought, the most beautiful thing she had witnessed in Nevada. She laughed, a real laugh, warm and sudden. That is the most unusual compliment I have ever received. I mean it as one, he said. I know you do, she said. That is why it works. He reached across the porch rail and took her hand, not in the formal way of their first handshake on the platform, but in the quiet way of a man who has thought about it for a while and decided that this is the right moment. His hand was large and work-rough and warm, and she turned her own hand palm up to meet it. They sat like that while the sky finished its performance and the stars began their quiet emergence, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and it was the most comfortable silence she had ever been in. She wrote to Ruth the following Tuesday with a lightness in her chest that she suspected translated to her handwriting, because Ruth's reply 3 weeks later began, Margaret, something has happened. I can see it in the way you form your letters. Tell me everything. She wrote back and told her most of it, and Ruth, who was a practical and warm-hearted woman, wrote back to say that she was extraordinarily pleased, and also that the curriculum was working wonders with the 7-year-old girls, which Margaret thought was the perfect response. Fall came to the high desert with a cleanliness and a beauty that she had not expected, though she was developing the suspicion that Nevada was simply full of things she had not expected. The aspen along the creek turned gold all at once, as if they had made a collective decision, and the air sharpened and the light became the particular angled gold of autumn, and the work of the ranch shifted to the preparations for winter. Cattle moved to lower pastures, hay stores checked and counted, firewood cut and stacked until the stack beside the house was taller than she was. She helped with the firewood stacking. Isaac had not asked her to, but she had seen the size of the job and the number of hands available, and applied herself to it the way she applied herself to things she decided were worth doing. Pete and Arlo both watched her the first day with the specific expression of men who have been told something and are seeing the evidence of it being true, and by the end of the first hour they had simply incorporated her into the work as if she had always been there. Isaac came around the end of the woodshed and stopped when he saw her, his arms full of split lengths of pine. He looked at her. He looked at Pete and Arlo. He looked at the rapidly growing stack. Are you going to tell me to go inside? She asked. No, he said. He set down his armload and picked up the next one. I was going to ask if you needed gloves. She looked at her hands, which were red from the cold and the rough bark. Yes, actually, she said. He went inside and came back with an old pair of his own leather-work gloves, which were too large for her by half, and she put them on, and the excess flopped at her fingertips and made her look as if she had the hands of a man 3 times her size. And Isaac looked at this, and his expression broke into a full, proper smile for the first time she had seen it. And it was, she thought with the part of her brain that catalogued such things for future consideration, an extraordinary smile. It changed his face entirely, not into something different but into something more completely itself. She laughed again, which she was doing more of in Harlan Creek than she had done in years, and he laughed too, and Pete and Arlo looked at each other with the expressions of men who are witnessing something and have the wit to know it. October moved forward and Isaac asked her, on a quiet Sunday afternoon, if she would marry him. He had not arranged anything elaborate. He had not strewn wildflowers or located a ring or engaged a reverend. He simply came in from the corrals at 3 in the afternoon, washed his hands at the kitchen pump, poured himself a glass of water, and stood in the kitchen doorway looking at her at the kitchen table where she was writing to Ruth and said, "I want to ask you to marry me. I mean really marry me, not just the arrangement, if you are willing." She set down her pen. "Are you asking because things have changed for you?" she said. "Or are you asking because it is the logical next step in the arrangement?" "Because things have changed," he said without hesitation. She looked at him for a moment. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which she had come to understand was his tell, and his eyes were doing the complicated thing they did when he cared about the outcome of something. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He crossed the kitchen and she stood up from the table, and he took both her hands in his, the large, warm, rough hands she had come to know well over these months, and he looked at her with those gray-green eyes that had first looked at her counter-proposal on the platform with serious, careful attention, and he said, "I am glad you came to Harlan Creek, Margaret." "So am I," she said. "I am very glad." He kissed her then, for the first time, quietly and warmly, in the kitchen in the October afternoon light, and she kissed him back with the full and honest heart of a woman who had found the thing she had been looking for without entirely knowing she was looking for it. They were married on the 8th of November, 1882, in the Harlan Creek Church, which was a small white building that held 40 people comfortably and 56 on this particular Saturday, because the town of Harlan Creek had developed opinions about Margaret Underwood and about Isaac Donnelly, and about what the two of them together meant for the community. And those opinions had collected into a general warmth that expressed itself in the form of a full church, and a table outside afterward loaded with contributed dishes. The Reverend was a small man named Hawkins who conducted ceremonies with the economical dignity of someone who believed that the important thing was the words and not the ornamentation. Margaret wore her blue wool dress, which she had pressed and freshened, and which had, she thought, seen enough of this adventure that it deserved to see the completion of this part of it. She had braided her dark hair back with a ribbon that Della Briggs had given her, a ribbon the color of cream. Isaac wore the suit she had not yet seen, a dark brown that fit him well and that he wore with the slight self-consciousness of a man who is more comfortable in working clothes, and she thought he was the finest-looking man in the room, which was perhaps a biased assessment but one she felt confident in. He met her eyes when she came down the aisle. It was a short aisle, and what was in his eyes was not the complicated, careful thing she was accustomed to seeing there. It was something simple. It was happiness. She felt the same. They said the words. The Reverend pronounced them married. Isaac kissed her, and the room made the sound rooms make when they are full of people who are genuinely pleased by an outcome. And Della Briggs, who was not a sentimental woman by nature, was seen to press her handkerchief briefly to the corner of her eye. Pete, who had been recruited as a witness, managed to look both uncomfortable in his best shirt and genuinely moved at the same time, which Margaret thought was very Pete of him. The supper that followed on the tables outside was the best meal she had eaten in Nevada, possibly in her life, the kind of meal that happens when a whole community brings its best to the same table. There was dancing afterward, a fiddle player who attacked his instrument with an enthusiasm that somewhat outpaced his accuracy, but whose energy was impossible not to respond to. And she danced with Isaac, which she had not done before, and discovered that he danced with the same quality he did everything physical with economy and sureness, no wasted movement, leading with a quiet confidence that was a pleasure to follow. She also danced with Pete and with Arlo and with Mr. Vane and with the butcher and with Della Briggs's young son, who was 11 and enormously serious about the whole business. And once, surprisingly, with Sheriff Vickers, who turned out to be a capable dancer and who told her with quiet sincerity that Isaac Donnelly was a better man for having her and that she was good for Harlan Creek. "I hope to be," she said. "You already are," he said. "The school supplies for a start, and the fence business, and the way Isaac has had some color back in his face since spring. He said this last part matter-of-factly, as if he were reporting the weather. She looked across the outdoor tables to where Isaac was standing with a group of ranchers, talking. As if he felt her looking, he turned, and their eyes met across the party, and he gave her that small, private, almost smile that was different from the full, open smile she had first seen over the flopping work gloves, but which she loved equally and which was for her specifically. She turned back to Sheriff Vickers and said, "I think we are good for each other." "Best kind of arrangement," he said, which was the right word and the wrong word simultaneously, and she thought she would tell Isaac that later and he would find it as apt as she did. Gerald Cotter attended the wedding in the way people attend things they did not particularly want to attend, but calculated it would be worse to be conspicuously absent. He brought a gift, a serviceable piece of ironware, and departed early. Margaret shook his hand when he arrived with the same direct cordiality she would have offered anyone, and neither sought conversation with him nor avoided it, and she thought afterward that this was the right treatment. Not forgiveness, exactly, because he had not asked for it and did not deserve it unreservedly, but a careful civility that left room for him to become a better neighbor if he chose. Whether he would choose that remained to be seen. Winter settled in, and the ranch contracted to its winter self, turned inward, the days shorter and the evenings longer and the warmth of the house more insistent. Margaret's room became a room she used for her correspondence and her writing, and she slept in Isaac's room in the broad iron bed under a quilt that had been Clara's, and which she treated with the respect owed to anything that had been loved. She had found that living so closely with another person, a man she was still in the continuous process of knowing, was nothing like she had expected it to be. It was not the difficulty she had been braced for. It was ordinary in the way the deepest things tend to be ordinary. They argued sometimes, twice seriously, once about money and once about a decision Isaac had made regarding a contract for next spring's cattle sale without consulting her, and she had made her dissatisfaction clear in her particular way, which was direct and specific and not theatrical, and he had listened and acknowledged that he should have discussed it with her. And she had acknowledged in return that his knowledge of the cattle market was superior to hers, and that she should trust his judgment on the specifics while still being kept informed in general. And they had arrived at a working resolution that felt more sturdy. For having been built through disagreement rather than around it, she told Ruth about the argument in a letter, and Ruth wrote back, "You have found the rarest thing, Margaret, a man who argues in good faith." She thought Ruth was right. Winter wore into the new year, 1883, and the new year brought several things. It brought a letter from the Philadelphia Educational Board that Ruth had apparently been corresponding with on Margaret's behalf, informing her that the curriculum she had developed had been approved for trial in 3 schools in the city, and that she was being offered a formal consultation credit and a modest fee. She read the letter twice standing in the kitchen, then went to the corral where Isaac was working and read it to him. He looked up from the hinge he was mending and listened to the whole thing with his head tilted slightly, which was his listening posture, and when she finished he said, "Philadelphia." "I am not going to Philadelphia," she said immediately. He searched her face. "You do not have to stay for me if Isaac," she said firmly. "I am not going to Philadelphia. I am staying here where I live with you, and I will do the consultation work by post as I have done all along." She paused. "I want to make sure you know that there is no contest between the curriculum work and this life. They are both my life." He set down the hinge. "All right," he said. There was relief in it, carefully managed, not quite hidden. "I like it here," she said, which was true and perhaps also more than true, but it was the simplest version of the thing. The spring came with its particular extravagance, the desert blooming in the narrow weeks when moisture and warmth overlapped, and with the spring came the discovery that she was expecting their first child. She told Isaac on a Tuesday afternoon in her room, where she had been sitting after calculating dates and trying to decide whether she was certain before she said anything, because she was someone who preferred certainty. She had concluded she was certain enough. She went and found him in the barn, because she did not want to wait any longer once she had decided to say it. He was tending a horse with a stone bruise on its front right hoof, crouched down with the hoof braced against his knee, and he looked up when she came in. She stood in the barn doorway with the spring sunlight at her back, and she said, "I believe we are going to have a child." He looked at her. He set the horse's hoof down with the same careful gentleness with which he did all physical things, and he straightened, and he looked at her for a long moment that she could not entirely read, and then he crossed the barn to her and took her face in his hands, which were large and rough and exactly the right temperature, and he said, "Margaret." "Yes," she said, because it seemed the right word. He kissed her, and it was a kiss of a different quality than the others, something deeper in it, something that she would remember with precision for the rest of her life. "Are you?" he said, and stopped. "I am well," she said. "I am very well." "Good," he said. "I need you to be well." She put her hands over his, the hands still cradling her face. "I intend to be," she said. He brought his forehead down to rest against hers, and they stood like that in the barn doorway with the spring sun coming in around them, and the sound of the horses moving in their stalls and the creak audible in the distance. And she felt something so complete that it had no name she knew of, only the quality of it, which was like standing in a place you have always been meant to be and finally knowing it. Summer arrived again, her second Nevada summer, and she was large with child through the July heat, and she found that Nevada summer and pregnancy were both things she could manage if she was sensible about it, which she was. She reduced the bookkeeping hours at Della's store to 2 hours on Mondays only. She continued the correspondence with Ruth and with Mr. Vane, who had by now expanded the school's library considerably, and was seeing results that he reported with the barely contained excitement of a young teacher who has discovered that the work is actually working. Isaac was attentive without being suffocating, which was exactly the balance she needed, and which she had not been certain any man could actually manage. He checked in on her without hovering. He made adjustments to the daily workload that distributed more of the heavier physical tasks to Pete and Arlo without any fanfare or discussion of why, which meant she was not constantly being reminded of her condition as if it were an inconvenience. He moved the water pump handle so it required less force to operate, and he did not mention this either. It was simply done one morning, and she noticed it and said nothing and was enormously grateful. She told Ruth this in a letter, and Ruth wrote back that she was weeping with joy, and she found when she read it that her eyes were also doing something similar, which was unusual for her, and which she attributed to the hormonal excesses of pregnancy, but which she suspected was actually simply happiness. The child was born on the 14th of September, 1883, delivered with the assistance of Dr. Marsh from Harlan Creek, who arrived with 50 minutes to spare, and Della Briggs, who arrived before him and who was, it emerged, a calm and entirely competent presence in a birthing room. Isaac was outside, because that was how it was done, and she could hear him through the window walking the porch boards in a way that told her he was not managing the waiting well, and she found this both endearing and amusing, though she was too occupied to do anything about it. The child was a boy. He was healthy and loud and had a great deal of dark hair and the look of someone who had arrived with firm opinions already in place. Della put him in Margaret's arms, and Margaret looked at him with the particular expression of people confronted by something they had prepared for, and which has nonetheless exceeded all preparation. Isaac was brought in. He came through the door and stopped when he saw her, saw the child in her arms, and his face did the thing it had done in the church, went simple. Just happiness, uncomplicated. He crossed to the bed and sat beside her, and she put the child carefully into his arms, and he received him with the same careful strength with which he handled all things that mattered to him, and he looked at his son and then looked at her and said, "He looks like you." "He is very loud," she said. "Good," Isaac said. "He should be able to make himself heard." She laughed, tired and full of feeling, and he looked at her over their son's head with the full open smile that she had first seen over the flopping work gloves, and she thought that this was the thing she had come west to find without knowing what it was called, and that she had found it in Harlan Creek, Nevada, in the spring of 1882, on a platform in the coal smoke with a 6-page document in her hand. They named him Thomas, after Isaac's father. Thomas was loud and determined, and it became clear in the first weeks, fundamentally sunny in temperament once his basic requirements were met, which requirements he expressed without ambiguity. He had Isaac's gray-green eyes and Margaret's dark hair, and what appeared to be a wholly individual nose that belonged to neither of them, and which Pete described as a nose that knows what it thinks, which was perhaps the most accurate description anyone offered. Life reorganized itself around Thomas with the inevitability that all lives reorganize around children, and Margaret found that she had more capacity for this reorganization than she had previously supposed, which was information about herself that she stored carefully. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good one in the quiet sense contained, close. The ranch turned in on itself, and the house warm with the fire and the presence of 3 people who were finding their specific gravity with each other. Isaac worked the reduced winter schedule and was in the house more than in summer, and she found that she liked this. They played cards in the evenings. She had taught him a card game she had learned in Philadelphia that he took to with irritating speed, and read by the fire and talked, which was something she had not expected to be one of the pleasures of the marriage, but which had become one of the primary ones. He told her things in the winter that he had not told her in the busy spring and summer. He told her about his childhood on this same land, about his father's stubbornness and his mother's wisdom, and the way the two had made a kind of working harmony. He told her about the years before Clara, when he had been a young ranch hand on other people's property and had saved every cent for the land he knew he wanted. He told her about Clara with a gentleness that was neither painful to hear nor carefully managed, but simply true, the way a person speaks of something they have put in its right place. She told him about Philadelphia, about the boarding house and the 2 broken engagements and the feeling she had lived with for years, of being too much of something and not enough of something else, of not fitting the mold that the world had prepared for her. She told him about the evening she had read his advertisement and known, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that this was the direction she needed to go. "You knew from the advertisement," he said. "I knew I had to find out," she said. "There is a difference. What made you write the counter-proposal?" he asked. She thought about this. "Because I knew that if I came here on any man's terms but my own, I would not be myself when I arrived," she said. "And the only thing I had to offer you was exactly myself, not some arrangement of a self but the actual thing." She paused. "I needed to know if you were the kind of man who could receive that." He was quiet for a moment. Thomas was asleep in his cradle beside the fire. "And," he said, "you read every word," she said, "and you said I would do more than fine." She looked at him with the warmth she had stopped trying to manage or measure months ago, that simply lived in her chest when she looked at him. "You were right, incidentally. I have done more than fine." He looked at her across the fire. "So have I," he said, and the way he said it with the full weight of what he meant by it was the most honest thing she had heard in her life. Spring came to Nevada for the second time since her arrival, and with it a letter from Ruth that contained news of the Philadelphia curriculum's formal adoption in 6 schools, with Margaret listed as a contributing educational consultant, which was a title that made her feel the particular deep satisfaction of work that has found its proper recognition. She read the letter aloud to Isaac at breakfast, and he listened, and when she finished he said, "We should celebrate that." "We should," she agreed. "What would you like to do?" she thought. "I would like to have Della and the Vickers to supper," she said, "and Mr. Vane." She paused. "And I would like a cake, a proper one." He nodded. "I can get the ingredients from town." "I can make the cake," she said. "I know you can," he said. "I said I would get the ingredients." She looked at him over her coffee cup. He looked back. They had been doing this for 2 years now. This specific conversation that was not really a conversation about coffee and cake and ingredients, but about the particular pleasure of being with someone who simply understood you, and it never became less. The supper was held the following Saturday, and the table that had been 4 chairs when she arrived was extended to 8 with a piece of timber Isaac had fitted as a leaf, and the house smelled of the good food she and Della had spent the afternoon preparing, and the evening was everything she had hoped. Della told a story about her earliest days in Harlan Creek that had the table helpless, and Sheriff Vickers turned out to have a dry wit beneath his official manner that she had only glimpsed before, and Mr. Vane described the reading progress of his students with a passion that made everyone at the table lean forward slightly. Thomas, who was 6 months old and should by rights have been asleep, was passed around the table at some point, and received everyone's attention with the equanimity of a person who has decided that the world is essentially well-disposed toward him. Isaac sat at the head of his table and watched the room with the quiet, engaged expression of a man who is entirely where he wants to be, and Margaret sat at the other end and met his eyes across the length of the table and thought, "This is a life. Not just an arrangement, not just a counter-proposal. A life built from honest terms and honest feeling and all the ordinary extraordinary work of two people who decided to take each other seriously." The summer that followed brought another change that Harlan Creek registered with great interest. Gerald Cotter sold his ranch. The news came through Della, as most news of significance in Harlan Creek did, on a Monday morning while Margaret was doing the accounts. Cotter had apparently decided that ranching in Nevada was less profitable than he required, and had taken an offer from a cattle company and departed for California. The property was purchased by a family named Aldrich, 3 brothers and their families, who arrived from Kansas with children and dogs, and an optimistic approach to the land that Margaret found refreshing after 18 months of Cotter as a neighbor. She and Isaac rode over to introduce themselves 2 weeks after the Aldriches arrived and found a property in cheerful chaos, the kind of productive disorder that happens when capable people are reorganizing a space to suit themselves. The eldest brother, James Aldrich, was perhaps Isaac's age, with a steady handshake and a direct way of speaking, and his wife Hannah was a compact, efficient woman who took one look at Margaret and said, "Thank God, another woman with sense this side of the ridge." This was the beginning of a friendship that would prove important, because Hannah Aldrich was one of those women who carries the energy of 5 people in a single frame, and who made things happen in the communities she entered. And what she immediately wanted to make happen in Harlan Creek was an expansion of the school. She and Margaret sat on the Donnelly porch 2 weeks later with Thomas on a blanket between them and a pot of tea, and talked for 3 hours straight, which was more continuous conversation than Margaret had had in one sitting since she had left Philadelphia, and it was extraordinary. Hannah had ideas. Margaret had structure. The two of them together produced, by the end of the 3 hours, the outline of a proposal for a second classroom and a second teacher that they were going to present to the town. Isaac came out at the end of it to find them both still talking and Thomas asleep on the blanket with the expression of a man who has heard all he can take for one day, and he looked at the two of them and said to James Aldrich, who had followed him out, "I believe this is the beginning of something." "It is," James said. "Get used to it." The proposal was presented at the next town meeting, and passed with a majority that suggested most of Harlan Creek had been waiting for someone to make the case. Construction on the second classroom began in October, funded by the collected contribution, the Donnelly and Aldrich families jointly providing the lumber from their properties, and finished in December in time for the spring term. Margaret stood inside the new classroom on the December afternoon when it was completed and looked at the clean plastered walls and the rows of desks that had been contributed by various families throughout the valley, and she felt the specific satisfaction of a thing done from the beginning to the end. Isaac came in behind her and stood beside her and looked at the room. "You built this," he said. "Hannah and I built this," she corrected. And the town. Margaret, he said. She heard something in her name in his voice. She turned. You know what I mean. She did know what he meant. She looked back at the classroom. I came here with a counter-proposal, she said, because I did not want to arrive as an empty space waiting to be filled. I wanted to be useful in a way that was mine. She looked at him. I did not expect to find so much to be useful for. You found a whole town, he said. I found a life, she said. That is better. The year turned into 1885, and Thomas learned to walk with the single-minded determination of a child who has identified a goal and refuses to acknowledge obstacles, which Margaret thought was promising. He walked at 11 months, which Pete declared to be the most Donnelly thing that child could have done, and he walked with a wide-legged certainty that suggested he felt the ground was his particular property. In the spring of 1885, Margaret discovered she was expecting again. This time she told Isaac in the kitchen, in the morning, before the coffee had finished brewing, because she had learned that there were things you did not save for the right moment but simply said when they were true. He stopped in the middle of pouring water and set the kettle down and looked at her. You are certain, reasonably, she said. I am not always wrong about these things. He came around the table and took her hands in his and said, Good. You are not going to say anything else, she said. I am thinking several things, he said. I am trying to select the right one, she laughed. Tell me all of them. He sat down across from her and told her all of them, which took a while because he was feeling things he was not entirely used to feeling, the particular quality of a happiness that keeps exceeding itself every time you think you have understood it fully. He told her he was happy, which she knew. He told her Thomas would have a companion, which she had considered. He told her that the east bedroom, which had been used for storage since she arrived, was plenty large enough to convert. He told her finally, quietly, that he had not thought any of this would be part of his life again when Clara died, that he had thought he was done with the kind of fullness that a family produces, and that he had been wrong in a way that he was grateful for every single day. She said, I am glad I wrote the counter-proposal. So am I, he said. I read every word of it. I know, she said, that is when I knew. When you knew what, he said. That you were worth coming to Nevada for, she said. The second child was born in October of 1885, a girl this time, who arrived with considerably more efficiency than Thomas had, and with an expression of serene assessment that made Della Briggs say she looked like someone conducting a survey. They named her Ellen after Isaac's mother, and Ellen proved to have Isaac's capacity for stillness and Margaret's capacity for attention, which meant she was quiet and missed nothing, a combination that would serve her extraordinarily well. By the winter of 1885, the Donnelly Ranch had 2 children, a second bedroom converted and furnished, a new east fence that did not creep, a neighboring family with whom the Donnellys had the easy friendship of people who are genuinely suited in temperament and direction, and a kitchen that smelled every evening of something good. Pete had been with the ranch for 12 years now and showed no signs of leaving, and Arlo had met a young woman from the family of one of the Aldrich brothers' hired hands, and was in the process of becoming a more settled and domestic version of himself, a development that amused Pete endlessly. The school had its 2 classrooms now, and a second teacher had been hired, a young woman named Miss Clara, and yes, the name caught Margaret momentarily, but it was a common name and the young woman was entirely herself, full of energy and with a gift for the younger students, and the enrollment had grown from 23 to 41 students in the valley, which meant that Harlan Creek was growing, which meant in turn that the world was moving in the direction of here. Margaret's consulting work had expanded further, the correspondence now going not only to Ruth, but to 3 other educational institutions that had approached her through Ruth's recommendation, and she had begun, in the quiet hours of Thomas's and Ellen's naps, to write something longer, a document that was half curriculum and half argument, a case for the particular kind of education that small Western communities needed, that was different in character from what Eastern cities required. Rooted in the specific realities of a life where the land was always present, and the community was always close, and the children needed to be able to navigate both the practical and the intellectual with equal competence. She showed it to Isaac when it was half-written, 70 pages of careful argument and specific proposal, and he read it in 2 evenings by the fire while she watched him and pretended she was not watching him. When he finished, he set it down and said, "Send this to Philadelphia." "I intend to," she said. "Send it to Washington," he said. She blinked. "Washington, the Department of Education," he said matter-of-factly. "They are looking at Western schooling. I read about it in the territorial newspaper last month." He looked at her with that steady gray-green certainty. "Send it to Washington." She looked at the stack of pages. She looked at him. She said, "You think it is good enough." "I think it is necessary," he said. "Which is better?" She sent it to Washington in the spring of 1886, with a cover letter that was 6 pages long, which she noted with some private amusement was exactly the same length as the counter-proposal with which she had begun this whole adventure. She did not mention this to Isaac, and then she thought, "Why shouldn't I?" and told him, and he smiled the full open smile that she would never stop loving the sight of. The document was acknowledged by the Department of Education in June of 1886, with a letter of genuine substance, rather than mere courtesy, requesting additional materials, and noting that her analysis of Western community educational needs was being incorporated into a broader policy review. She stood at the kitchen table and read this letter twice, as she had read that first response from Isaac Donnelly, General Post, Harlan Creek, Nevada, 4 years ago, standing in her Philadelphia boarding house, and she felt the same quality of rightness, the sense of a direction confirmed. She went to find Isaac in the corral, because that was where she went when things happened that mattered, the corral or the barn or wherever his hands were occupied with the work of the ranch, and she told him, and he listened, and when she finished he looked at her for a moment and then he said, "Come here." She went to him and he held her, there in the corral with the October dust and the horses moving in the late afternoon light, and she rested her head against his chest and felt his heartbeat steady and sure like the land itself. "Margaret," he said into her hair. "Yes, I need you to know something. Tell me." "When I put that advertisement in the Philadelphia paper," he said, I was not expecting much. I thought I needed someone capable, someone who could manage. I was not looking for this." "What is this?" she said, though she knew. "Everything," he said. "You are everything I have that I would not trade for anything on this earth." She closed her eyes. She breathed in the smell of him, horses and leather and the particular clean warmth of a man she had known so well for 4 years that his presence was as familiar as her own heartbeat, and as surprising always as the Nevada sky. "You read my counter-proposal," she said. "All 6 pages of it." "I did," he said. "That was when you decided." He thought about it. "That was when I knew there was a chance," he said, which was an honest and precise distinction and which she loved him for making. Thomas was 3 now and running the property with the cheerful chaos of a toddler who has learned that the world contains horses and dogs and Pete and Arlo and an infinity of interesting rocks and gravel. Ellen was 1, and sitting up with the focused air of someone taking inventory. Life at the Donnelly Ranch was full in every sense of the word, full of work and full of people, and full of sound, and full of the particular warmth that comes from a place where people are genuinely glad to be where they are. In the spring of 1887, the family went to Philadelphia. This had not been planned originally, but had become necessary when the Department of Education requested Margaret's presence at a 2-week consultation on Western frontier education policy, and it was Isaac who said, without hesitation, that they would all go, that he had never been east of St. Louis and would like to, and that Pete and Arlo were perfectly capable of managing the ranch for 2 weeks. She was not sure what she had expected of that journey, but what she had not expected was to see Isaac Donnelly encounter Philadelphia, and to love him even more for the specific and particular way he encountered it. He was not overwhelmed. He was not dismissive. He was interested, in the careful way he was interested in everything new, asking questions, observing, making the quiet assessments of a man who is adding something to his understanding, rather than defending the understanding he already has. He met Ruth Calloway, who had been Margaret's correspondent for 4 years and had become, through that correspondence, one of her most important friends, and Ruth and Isaac took to each other immediately, because they were recognizably similar people, direct, thoughtful, more interested in what was true than what was comfortable. Ruth looked at the two of them together and said to Margaret privately, at the first opportunity, "He is exactly what you described and also not remotely what I imagined, and I am very glad you found him." "So am I," Margaret said. "Every day." The consultation went well. The people she had been corresponding with for years turned out to be human-sized and specific when met in person, as people invariably do. And the work she had been doing in isolation on the ranch in Nevada was, in this room in Philadelphia, recognized as substantial and necessary. And she sat at the long table in the department building and argued her position with the calm clarity she brought to all arguments. And Isaac sat in the room during the public sessions and listened with his full attention. And she looked at him once across the room, and he gave her the small, private, almost smile, and she turned back to the table feeling fortified. They were back in Nevada in 2 weeks, as promised, and Pete and Arlo had managed everything perfectly, and the ranch was in order, and the horses were fine, and the only irregularity was that Arlo had used the time to formally propose to his young woman, which had been accepted, and which Pete reported with the combination of affection and mockery that characterized his feelings about most things he approved of. Fall came again with its gold aspen and its angled light, and Margaret sat on the porch in the evening with Ellen in her lap and Thomas playing in the yard and Isaac beside her, and the mountains were purple in the last light, and the creek was audible in the distance, and she thought about a platform in a coal-smoke afternoon in 1882, a 6-page document and a man who had read every word of it and looked up and said something she had not expected. She said, "Do you remember what you said when you finished reading the counter-proposal on the platform?" He turned to look at her. "She will do more than fine," he said. "You said it to yourself," she said. "You said afterward that it came out incorrectly." "It came out exactly correctly," he said. "I meant it." "I know," she said. "But you meant it practically then. You meant that I was capable." "Yes," he said. "What do you mean it now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he was quiet before he said something that mattered. Thomas had found a large, interesting stick and was informing it of his opinions. Ellen had her fist around Margaret's finger and was conducting her usual careful survey of the middle distance. The sky was doing what Nevada skies did, turning itself into something that should not reasonably exist. "I mean," he said, "that you have done more than fine, more than anyone could have asked for or anticipated or deserved." He looked at her steadily. "More than I knew how to hope for." She looked at him. This man she had come west to find or not to find. The man who had taken her at her own word from the very first moment and had never stopped. Who had made room for her work and her afternoons and her opinion and her ink-stained fingers and her habit of telling him difficult things plainly, because she had decided very early that honesty was the foundation of everything worth building. Who had shown her Nevada and taught her horses and shared his grief without being crushed by it and built a life with her that she would not trade for any life she could imagine. "So have you," she said, "done more than fine." He reached over and took her hand, the hand that was not holding Ellen's small, determined fist, and they sat as the sky finished its performance and the stars emerged, and the coyote on the hillside made its lonesome sound, and the house behind them was warm and lit, and the land stretched out around them in the dark, 600 acres of Nevada that had once been a hopeful claim and was now entirely home. Thomas came running across the yard with his interesting stick and crashed into Isaac's legs with the full confidence of a child who knows he will be caught. And Isaac caught him with his free hand and pulled him up onto his knee. And Thomas announced at considerable volume that the stick was the best stick, and that he needed supper immediately. Ellen looked at her brother with the expression of someone noting his energy with detached interest. Margaret looked at the three of them, her husband with his Creekwater eyes, her son with his strong opinions and his magnificent nose, her daughter with her quiet, watchful intelligence, and she felt something so complete that it had no proper edge, nothing around it, nothing outside of it. It was simply the whole of the thing. She had come to Harlan Creek with a counter-proposal in her pocket because she had believed, at her most essential level, that she deserved to be taken seriously. She had found a man who agreed. From that agreement, everything else had grown: this life, these children, this home in the enormous sky of Nevada, this work that reached back east and mattered, these friends who had become family, these evenings on the porch with the purple mountains and the creek running in the distance. She had done more than fine. They both had. And as Thomas finally negotiated his supper into existence, and Isaac carried him inside with Ellen balanced on his other arm, and the door swung open, and the warm light of the house spilled out onto the porch boards, Margaret Underwood, Margaret Donnelly, who was both names and would always be both names, because she had never been the kind of woman to leave herself behind, stood up from her chair and followed her family inside. And the evening closed around the house like a hand, around something it intends to keep.